The work of racial justice has many components. On the one hand, there are outward actions like participating in local forms of democracy, voting with your dollars, or voicing dissent when someone makes a racist remark, even when it's not directed at you. Then, on the other hand, there are inward actions. My guest on today's podcast suggests that even to think or to sit with discomfort, that is a valid and meaningful action. And so is to acknowledge and validate someone's experience. I'm Nathaniel Bozarth, and this is Wide Ruled. Quick note before we begin, all of this season recordings take place over Zoom. Please bear with a few Zoomy type glitches in this episode. Edgar, thanks for coming on the podcast. This is Wide Ruled. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Edgar Palacios. I am the founder of the Latinx Education Collaborative here in Kansas City, Missouri. I should talk about what we do at the LEC. We're working on increasing the representation of Latinx educators in K-12. We do it through three verticals, the first being community building. It's so important that we create a home for educators for our community because they tend to feel isolated in their environments. They tend to feel unsupported. And so we want to create that environment for them to be a part of and to think, I think that helps with the retention work long-term. Secondly, we do pathway exposures. We want to really encourage and invite students, particularly middle school and high school students, to become teachers one day. Definitely invite them into that conversation. And then finally, we've called this recruitment support. I think the language is going to shift on this a little bit, but we want to support districts and schools and really creating communities of belonging. We know that when our Latinx educators feel like they belong in school, they feel supported, that they're going to stick around a little bit longer. And so all those three things add up to us trying to really thoughtfully and strategically increase the representation of Latinx educators in K-12.
Awesome. So I hear that in there, you kind of also like are comprehensive because the community kind of addresses like educators, teachers in the classroom now. Then the recruitment support is working with kind of that pipeline of talent of youth, and then the district. So there's almost like three different audiences or levels in there, right?
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that word comprehensive. I wrote it down because it's not a unique word, but it's definitely a word that helps explain the work that we're trying to do. I personally don't believe that you can do the work on just one of those verticals and actually increase representation. I think it takes at least those three, if not more. But those are the three that we're committed to. And yeah, it feels comprehensive. Although sometimes I'm told it's either not enough or way too much. And so I navigate between all that.
You can't please everyone.
I'm learning that.
Which you actually mentioned that on your website. I thought it was interesting. So Latinx is a term that there's some people love, some people don't love so much. And you actually reference that on your website.
Yeah. So I think I'll just give you the story of Latinx. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take you to my journey of identifying in the Latino community.
Yeah.
And so I was born in Miami, Florida, in the late 1900s, as the young kids say. And so when I was in Miami, my parents from Nicaragua, they came to this country in roughly 1981, and they were fleeing civil war, right? But I grew up being Nicaragüense and thinking about that's how I identified, right? And so in Miami, the Latino community is strong and it's incredibly diverse, as it is everywhere, but particularly in Miami. And so we identified as the country that our parents came from or that we came from, and so Nicaragua. And then I moved to Spokane, Washington between 5th and 6th grade. And that's when I remember being called Mexican, and I was confused because I wasn't Mexican. And I remember the term Hispanic. That's how I was identified. And so I used that term for a while. I'll spare you the details of Cape Girardeau when I went to high school there. And then I moved to Kansas City for college, where I started using the term Latino, right? And so in these different areas, my identity was either defined by others or it was very localized, right? And so I was trying to be cool, I think, in sometime in 2017, and I was like, I really like this term Latinx. I had heard it a couple of times. I honestly really like the X because it reminded me of X-Men. And I really like this idea, this concept of like the Latino superheroes around. And so that was the nerd in me.
That's
But I
awesome.
also I also really appreciated the X as, a symbol, right? A symbol of the diversity of our community. I
Mm.
tend to say that we transcend race, we transcend nationality, we transcend language as a community. And so like I think particularly in the Midwest here in the Kansas City area, I think most people have an idea of what a Latino is. And I think
Mm.
that person might be Mexican American. They're just there's a stereotypical type of Latino that people might think of here. And so I really like how that term um, pushes against those ideas and pushes against those narratives a little bit. What I didn't realize at the time was like how much people hated it, and maybe not hated it, but how much they didn't appreciate it or understood it. And so, um,
People
so it's
in
been
the
a,
Latino community or outside the Latino community?
I think people in the Latino community, people, I see it all the time. It happens usually around, it happens in the cycle like of quarters, right? Like somebody will post up this one article that shows up every kind of 3 months, and then people will like talk about it, and then it'll disappear, and then the same article will appear somewhere else in the internet, and like people will talk about it and it'll disappear. Um, what I think is funny about that strategy, and this is probably me saying too much, is like every time you talk about the word, like somebody else learns about it. And so if the idea is to keep the word out of the language, right, then like we should probably stop talking about it. But that's not what we're doing. Um, and I also, I think I also what I didn't appreciate at the time that I do now was like the history of terms in our community.
Mm.
I think about the term Hispanic and that being uh, mainstreamed in the 1970s with the census and Nixon. I think about the term Latino, and that coming into popularity in the early 1990s. I saw an article in the New York Times talking about how Latino was just going to be a fad. Like the Hispanics weren't about it, and Latino was going to be a fad. And we know how that ended. And so not dissimilar to Latinx, right? This idea of like we don't like it now collectively as a community, or we say we don't like it, but a lot of people are utilizing it, and a lot of people have actually evolved even further from that term. Like now I'm hearing the word Latine, I'm
Mm.
hearing Latino, I'm hearing a couple others, and so I'm like the conversation's clear, not over. um and it's a complicated, the identity in the Latino community is complicated, and so I think it was the right word for the time. And also, if I'm rambling too much, just let me know.
Oh, yeah.
It also helped me think about the type of educator that we want to support and that we
Mm.
want to help build. And so, I know that not everybody, not every educator, not every person is going to be a fan of the ward, and that's okay. And I think people can choose to identify how they want, and that's great. But are you able to create space in your classroom, in your school, for people who don't agree with you? Are you able to create space for students who may not come from your same background or have your same belief system? And are you able to create that space of belonging, right? And so I think the term Latinx to me is really like, I think I heard this on the West Wing one time. It's a shibboleth,
A
right?
shibboleth.
Do you know what a shibboleth
No,
is?
I don't.
I could be wrong. Again, like please fact check me on this. I know you
Okay.
will. But a shibboleth is a word it's kind of like a password, right?
Mm.
It's this idea that like it tells you something about the people who are using it, right? And
Mm.
so it gives you access to a community, or it takes away access from a community, right? So it's like a password, so to speak. um and so it tells me a lot about where people are on their identity journey,
Hmm.
and whether they're nascent in it or if they're like far more advanced. And it also just it helps me gauge people's like abilities to really adopt new ideas or even think about them or wrestle with them,
Mm.
um, which I appreciate. And so I didn't think that was going to be it at the beginning of the journey, but I like where it's gone to, and I've learned the hard way to love it and appreciate what that word means, and then to also know that 20 years from now, some young kid is going to come up and tell me like that I'm wrong about the term that I used, and I'm gonna wait for that moment. I'm going to receive it with open arms because that means that we have evolved yet again as a community.
Right on, right on. I think it's so interesting, like you talking about your identity creation process and how you at first identified, let's see if I can say it, Nicaraguense,
Absolutely.
with your yeah, as Nicaraguense instead of Latino or Hispanic, and how, I mean, I can't help but think like, how do I ask this?
Carefully.
Carefully, carefully. As a as a very white person, as a very uh what like in the yeah, carefully decide. I
I'm
think I
totally
already
kidding.
messed
Go
it
ahead,
up.
ask the question. I will rock with you.
What so how much of like the so like the census, you talked about the
Yeah.
census, how much of Latino identity has been sort of thrust upon the Latinx community by
Huh.
white people,
You know,
or
that's a
by an othering
yeah.
process?
It's fascinating, right? Because I think this is also where it's incumbent for us as a community to know our history, right? And particularly in the American context, right? I think that that's something that we forget. Like what we're talking about here is a very American construct. Um, we're not talking. People aren't having these same conversations in Nicaragua at the moment, right?
Mhm.
Like they're not talking about who's Latino, who's not Latino, and what that means and what that doesn't mean. In Nicaragua, like my joke is like I would be talking about creating more white educators. Like that would be the joke in that context, right? Um, but you know, let me tell you, I'll also share a little bit about what I'm learning about the history of
Mm.
Latinos and whiteness in general. And so it goes back to Guadalupe Hidalgo, I think in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexicans who were living on their lands, right, that were ceded over to the United States,
Mhm.
um, they had up to a year to determine if they were going to become citizens or not. So they had a choice of becoming a citizen or not. Um, and citizen at the time, back in the day, was defined as a free white person.
Right.
And so when a Mexican decided to become a citizen of the United States, legally, by definition, they became white. And I think that that's a really interesting, like, it leads to this concept that I've read about called legally white, socially brown,
Mm.
where Mexican Americans at that time were still discriminated against, still um, definitely discriminated against in many different ways. But they couldn't do anything about it because they were legally white. And so you can't, white people can't discriminate against white people, technically. Right. And so it was a really interesting legal loophole there. Um, and then you fast forward to like all these different cases in education where Latinos along the way were like pushing and fighting for their rights and to be integrated into the schools and not just have Mexican only schools and whatnot. But along that journey is this really difficult dance with whiteness, right? It's this
Yeah.
idea of like we either assimilate or we don't. If we assimilate in a certain way, we're going to lose some part of our culture here. And so like it's constant like this trying to balance this in between for the people and for our people. And so it makes me think about in the 1930s, that was the first census that the term, it was the first and only census that the term Mexican American was utilized.
Wow.
Right. So that's the only time Mexican Americans were able to identify as Mexican Americans on the census.
And they got clumped
Um,
after that.
right. And then,
Mm.
yeah, absolutely. In the 1970s, Nixon, I think, got a few Hispanic advisors. They're like, we need to do something about this group of people. They're not technically white. They're not technically black. Like they're in this in between. Um, and so thus came the word Hispanic. But what people don't remember or talk about is the tension between Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans, saying like we don't want to be lumped together. Like we're
Mm.
very different and distinct people. We don't want to be lumped together. And so there was anger at that word, right? 20 years later, Latino comes in into fashion, and we have authors like Sandra Cisneros saying like, I'm never going to use the term Hispanic, or will ever submit my work into an anthology with the word Hispanic in it, because that's a colonized mindset. And so if Latinos are using the word Hispanic, then clearly like they're not decolonized in any way, shape, or form. And so we got to fight against that. And so, yeah, this journey around the terms and the history and like our ever-present fight with whiteness and this an idea whether we belong or not, and do we assimilate or not, is very much at the present of it's rooted in our identity, right? And the struggle that we have, that sometimes we talk about it, sometimes we don't, all defined by others, right? Because you also have terms like Chicano, which is a term that Mexican Americans utilized, and it was an activist term. It still is an activist term, depending on what part of the country you're in. You have the Boricuas, my Puerto Rican friends out there, who like are really proud of their Taino roots. You have Dominicans who are never going to be Hispanic or Latino, according to them. They're just Dominican, right? And so you have all these other kind of constructs around identity, which is very difficult to unite. And so, it's the term Latinx was probably the first time that I deliberately chose a term that was then assigned to me by somebody else, right? Like I looked at that term and I was like, you know what, I vibe with it. It passes my vibe check. I'm cool with it. Let's utilize it. Let's see what it's about. But yeah, no, I think it's weird for Latinos in general, because they were assigned an identity, they were assigned a grouping, and they never had voice in that.
Yeah, that's I kind of want to sit with it, like it's because it's fascinating, and it's too bad. You said Sandra Cisneros said that Hispanic, she said Hispanic was a colonized mindset. Is that because it's when I hear the word Hispanic, I think I read it as like Spain, like relating to Spain? Is it because of like the colonization of Spain of Central, South and Central America, or is there another reason?
You know what? I found the quote, and so this is from an article called "Ideas and Trends: What's the Problem with Hispanic? Just Ask a Latino." And this was written by David Gonzalez in November of 1992. So we're nearing
the late 1900s.
The late 1900s, the late 1900s. And so it talks about this idea around like the terms and the interchangeability nature of it. But this is Sandra Cisneros talking. To say Latino is to say you come to my culture in a manner of respect, said Sandra Cisneros, the author of Woman Hollering Creek and Other Stories, who refuses to have her writings included in any anthology that uses the word Hispanic. To say Hispanic means you're so colonized you don't even know for yourself, or someone who named you never bothered to ask what you call yourself. It is a repulsive slave name. And then immediately after, you have this. Not so, insists Enrique Fernandez, the editor of Mas, a Spanish language entertainment magazine. In fact, he says Latino taken to its roots refers to an even older empire. That's the one that took over Spain. What he asks, does Latino have to do with Hispanics, Africans, and Native Americans? And so there's this battle of identity, right? Here you have two people, wow. Two not random Latinos, but like, they don't speak on behalf of the entire community. They're just two folks. And they have these very distinct concepts of whatnot. And what's interesting to me is if you think just a little bit more deeply around like the terms and this idea of colonization, and to say, Hispanic is a colonized term and Latino isn't. Latino is Spanish. And Spanish is a language of the colonizer. And so that gets awkward.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we're talking about, we're also missing the indigenous voice in our communities, because the reality is a lot of folks in our community don't speak Spanish, period. Mm-hmm. And so now we're just fighting over terms thinking that one's going to be like the best for us as a community, as a collective. And the reality is like not one term is going to do that justice.
Yeah.
Right. We're just too diverse. We're just too different as a community, individually. Like it's just not going to work. And so that's the struggle. That is the journey that I've been on since I said, you know what, I'm gonna call it the Latinx Education Collaborative. That sounds cool. Had no idea that what I was stepping into. And that's also part of the problem.
Hmm.
I should have known.
Hmm.
Like, this is history, right? This is history for my community. Like, this happened in the United States. These conversations have been happening in our country for hundreds of years. I never once stepped into a classroom where somebody was like, you know what? Let's talk about the terms.
Yeah.
Not once. I had to figure this out in my mid-30s. Like, this is crazy, you know? And so that's why I think about the work that we do and how important it is. You know, I want our community of educators to be well equipped with the history, with the understanding,
Hmm.
with the knowledge that this stuff is messy. And like they can talk about this with students so they feel less confused about it. So they feel like they belong more in these conversations than not. Because that's a real thing.
Yeah. What's it? Man, my mind's spinning with lots of like making connections and thinking about
Yeah.
things. Like that. I want to mention Ian Haney Lopez's book White by Law. Have you read that book?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think in as much as a book like that can be my favorite book, I think it is one of my favorite books because it totally helped shift my understanding. I think about it so often that we have legislated whiteness, and you talked about that with the option after Guadalupe Hidalgo for Mexican Americans to become citizens or not. Um, uh, and yeah, the talking about the legislation of whiteness and how this idea of whiteness is so fake. Like it's just arbitrary. Like it's an arbitrary thing that's a power structure that is legislated and created and shifting, and it's not only is it not biologically real, but it's made up, and then it becomes this social reality that causes so much harm. Uh, I don't know. I think about that a lot.
You know, I think that that's one of the hardest ideas for me to wrestle with in the mornings and like, you know, when I go to bed at night is this idea of like, what if I woke up tomorrow and race and ethnicity weren't a thing?
Wow.
Right? Like, how much of my identity would I lose if I woke up tomorrow and couldn't say that I was Latino?
Wow.
Right? And I asked this question to you know, I'll speak from the Latino perspective. You know, we're like, we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. We celebrate these ideas. We celebrate Latinidad. We talk about, you know, and at least in my day to day, we talk about the celebration of Latino identity, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so we're hooked on it. Like we've subscribed, we understand it, we want to have pride in it. And then we also have to acknowledge that it's like a social construct, right? And it's, to your point, not real. It was created. It wasn't. It's something that we had to learn, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I wonder, like, are we by talking about these issues, like, still upholding these ideas of otherness,
Yeah.
and or like, what happens if we didn't have that? Would we be classified in a very different way?
Oh, like would it be like height or
Right.
the other yeah.
You know, and like, and how deeply rooted is this concept of whiteness that if we were to lose the terms around it, because even in this idea of terms, right, we center whiteness and even how we identify ourselves, right? Like it's all based on white or not. We don't center black folks in this conversation when we're talking about identity. We center the
Mm,
white folks and like, here's how we're different than them, because that's all we've been taught.
yeah. Man, I feel like I've been learning a lot about I feel like it's been a slow process for, and it's going to be a lifelong process, but it's been especially slow. It feels to me to understand what it means to center whiteness. That one's been a slow uptake for me. Um,
I'll give you, you know what? Also, you talked about like this arbitrary nature or of this work, right? Or this concept of whiteness and how um, it's just made up. I think like 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to go down to the borderlands and just spend some time in like the Rio Grande Valley, which is a wild place. If you've never been to the Rio Grande Valley, it's a wild place. Um, and I spent some time at the Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge, and Rio Grande is right there. Across the Rio Grande is Mexico, clearly, and like you're right there. There's no gates. There's no border patrol. There's no any of that. It's just you're on one side of the river, and then on the other side is a whole different country. And it messed me up for a little bit because like
mm,
it's that simple, right? Like it was a shallow part of the river. I could have easily walked across it. And at that point, I would have been immigrating, right?
mhm.
I wouldn't have had the appropriate documents to be on that land. I wouldn't have had all these other things. Like I would have, you know, been the reverse of what we talk about here. And it was just wild to me that like somewhere along the way, someone deemed this as this artificial and arbitrary border where like just wild to me. And so it made me think about like who came to these lands and like created these rules that we
Yeah,
uphold to today.
yeah,
But they weren't original to it, right? So it's like we're just living in a fake kind of world a little bit. It's like the Matrix. I don't know. It was like
yeah.
the Matrix to a certain extent.
Totally. Well, I mean, you referenced earlier how like the American West was Mexico before it was, well, actually, ooh, do you have okay, sorry, two thoughts here. Um, the United States West was Mexico before it was the United States. And so there's that's a real brain trip for me because when Mexican people in particular are disparaged in this country, it's like, well, like technically Mexican people like are native to this land. Um, uh, but then so the other thought that came there is, so I lived in Honduras for a short amount of time when I was in college. And I remember learning that they took great umbrage in Honduras. My friends, the Catrachos, took great umbrage with the term American when used to only describe United States people from the United States. Like if I was going to say Americans, you would say Norteamericanos instead of just Americans. And I think that's like, how interesting is that? Like how entitled is that people who look like me use the term American so easily to just describe people who live in the United States when there's North and South America. There's a lot of land here and many people. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'm in the moment like Googling this because it's I'm Googling the official name of Mexico. And I think the official name of Mexico in English is the United Mexican States.
Oh,
Right.
really?
Yeah. So
I
you got
didn't
the
know
United
that.
States of America, and then you got the United Mexican States. Um,
Wow.
and to me, like it, my family's from Nicaragua, and so I've traveled to Nicaragua and I've spent time with my cousins and my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, and it's really interesting what happens when you center a very different identity.
Mhm.
Like they don't center American identity. Like it's not their identity. They don't talk about it. They don't think about it. Like their construct is Nicaragua.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, they're part of Central America, so technically they're Americans, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they like this idea. But I wonder, this is what one of my wonderings, like, do they feel that tied to this term American
Mm-hmm.
because they feel like they own it too, or is it because
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to adopt, or like we're trying to pursue whiteness,
Wow.
right? Like if somehow we think less of our countries or ourselves because like we want to be American so bad that we're just like, and I could be wrong. I don't know. This is a wondering that I have. Like I can't speak
Yeah.
to it. It's just something that always left me kind of recently has left me like awestruck. It happened when about a year ago, pre-pandemic. So a year and a half ago, close to 2 years, something like that. I don't know. I can't tell time anymore.
Same.
Um,
It's still
there was
2020, right?
right. It has to be. In fact, I earlier this morning I was like, you know what? I'm going to celebrate the new year this year, and I'm going to just call it 2021. Like 2020 never happened. Like it never went away. Um, but we were like I was invited to go speak to a group of young students that were traveling. They came here to the United States on a tour from Mexico, and like I started asking them questions like, what do you want to do when you grow up? Like, where do you want to go? Where do you want to study? And like a lot of the students were like, I want to come to the United States to study. And then, like my question to them was like, what makes you think that the United States has better universities than Mexico does?
Mm.
What makes you think that like, because there's scholars in both countries, right?
Yeah.
You got history in Mexico. You got all these ideas. You got talent in this country. You have long-standing institutions that have been around for centuries, right? Like you have that. And so it always interests me like how we value America and how my cousins and my family members valued America and how they saw this. The narrative is strong for the United States, like this land of opportunity, this land of freedom, this land of these higher ideals, and like my cousins believe that, right? I remember one night, my cousin and I were talking. He was like, it must be amazing to live in a country that everywhere is like concrete. You got huge buildings and concrete, and like that was his concept of the United States. I was like, it's not like everywhere, but like I can see what you're talking about, right? So it's fascinating how even in our countries of origin, we still have this idea that America is this great, like it's the shining star of it. And I can't argue one way or the other whether it is or not. Like I still
Mm-hmm.
am out, like I still struggle with some of that because even my own identity, like I've never identified as an American until I'm in a different country,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. So my connection to America and the concept of America is very different, not because I want it to be, but because I've always been identified as something other than, right? Like I have the hyphenated American.
Yeah.
I've just never been full-fledged American.
Do you think it would be helpful or useful for me? So I actually have my parents did the DNA test a couple of years back, and it came back that both sides of my family, I'm like 98% British Isles. Like, do you think it would be helpful or useful if I started identifying as British American? Or I don't even know what the right term would be. British American. That sounds right.
I don't know, that's a good question. I don't know if it would be helpful. I think it would be cool in the sense that like you understand your connection to a different place and
Mhm.
you're elevating the idea that like you also come from somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
That like so I think that part of it's cool. I think from a general construct, like you're still white, right?
Yeah.
And like to me, like the British are like the ultimate whites. I don't know why.
No, I they're colonizers. Like J.C. Nichols in Kansas City perfected the racial restrictive covenant, and we went to the same high school. And the British perfected colonization.
Yeah.
So
Well, I'll tell you, I went to high
great
school
stock.
I went to the same high school as Rush Limbaugh.
Oh no!
That was my 4 years. Like, clearly we didn't go at the
Yikes!
same time,
Right.
but like that's who. In fact, one of my favorite teachers was tangentially like related to him through
Dang!
marriage, and so it's a wild
Wow.
like these places still exist, right? These high schools still exist where these folks
Yeah.
who like are leading these narratives created all these things, and so and we hold them up as heroes. I remember, um,
Ooh, I am glad to say I did not learn until much, much, much later
yeah,
that Jason Nichols went to my high school. They didn't celebrate that, which is great.
would they have uncelebrated it though? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Oh
would they
no,
have
oh
like
no,
named it
definitely
and
not.
be like, we're not talking about it anymore?
No, I actually got
Um,
to go talk to the teachers a couple of years back, and while some teachers appreciated the talk, there were definitely a few teachers that were upset by being reminded about that fact.
it is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's wildly fascinating because I remember going on the Rush Limbaugh tour, and his favorite place to eat, one of his favorite places to eat, was a Mexican restaurant in Cape
Mhm.
Girardeau, and that's just ironic to me. Like, that's just funny to me. Like, you're on the Rush Limbaugh tour, and you have to make it. You have to make a stop at the Mexican restaurant that's there. Funny to me.
Yeah. I mean, that's a picture of exploitation, right? Like, I'll take what serves me and what I enjoy, but then spend thousands of hours deriding the people and pushing awful policies. Yeah.
I just hope he left a good tip. Like, I really, I think about that.
Yeah. It's a little bit of reparations.
A little bit of reparations every bite of his pollo fundido.
Pollo fundido. What's pollo fundido?
It's a chicken breast like immersed in like cheese sauce.
Fundido. Oh, it
Amazing.
sounds like fondue. Yeah, yeah, right.
It's
Is it
yeah, yeah, yeah,
related?
yeah, yeah.
Fundido, fondue.
Yeah.
Nice. Um, can I ask you one more question about kind of identity? I don't want
Yeah.
to take advantage of your, vulnerability and like unpacking that. I have one more question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
About that. I have more than one question, but one question about that. So I do survey research, and I create a lot of surveys, and I've thought a lot about um, the the demographic questions that get put in surveys, and I think there's tons of discussion to have about it. Like one, like I think it's really important to only ask those questions when the information is actually going to be used. And there's important about like if it's going to be used, how is it going to be used to advance equity and justice, and not um, to reinforce stereotypes or other things, but to measure disparate impact. What for you is it like when I mean you referenced the census earlier, but then so many surveys that ask about race and ethnicity, there's generally oftentimes a question about um, Hispanic ethnicity, and then there's a race question. What would you be willing to talk about that
Yeah,
process of
for
what is that
sure.
like? Like what happens when you're answering those questions? Like, is there a crisis? Is it painful? Is it yeah.
I wouldn't say that it's painful for me only because like I'm used to it. And so like
Hmm.
um I remember always joking about it. Like, I actually wrote this like terrible. It was high school. It was like my senior year, and I wrote some sort of parody like thing. I forget who it was, but it was a parody thing, and like I wrote it and I submitted it to the Southeast Missourian, and like it's there, right? But on there, like I start this idea of like I start talking about my identity, right? And I'm clearly like struggling with my identity in these spaces, and like I think I make a joke in there, like I just want to be like Hispanic non-tan, Like I've always been pale, right? And so like that was my joke. I was like, can I just be Hispanic non-tan? Because I don't know how to do anything else. Um, but I'll tell you, like I had a real moment of crisis as when my daughter was born. And I took her to her first like appointment. And I'm at Children's Mercy East. Like I take her to, whatever the appointment, and I go in like they're asking me this demographic information. And they're like, all right, so, are you Hispanic, Latino? I'm like, yeah, Latino, yep. And then they're like, what's your race? And it was the first time in a long time. And like, I haven't been asked that. It's been a while since I've been asked that. And I couldn't answer it. Like I couldn't answer. Here I am. I do this work on a daily, right? Like I think about these issues daily. Like I help people try to navigate these issues. And then in that moment, I froze. And I was like, well, I'm definitely not white, but I'm not black. But there's no option for that.
Yeah.
And so I think I ended up saying like other and then just wrote Latinx as a race. Because I attended an REI training and I was like, they talk about the racialization of the Hispanic / Latino identity. And so I was like, what was funny though is like I go into that narrative, right? I'm trying to tell this lady as to why I'm choosing to do that. And she doesn't care. She's like, sir, I just need to write something down. And so it's not painful in that way, but it always is like the subtle reminder that like we're not white. But like we're the in between. And so that is a space that I think a lot of us know really well. And I actually believe that that's the space that we can organize around and build community around is this idea that most of us have been in that space where like we just don't fit into one thing neatly. And so I think about that a lot.
I think on the other hand, for me, it's just like, oh man, this is boring. I just have to keep doing white every time. It's the boring race to check. What does that say? What does that mean? Like, what?
It's weird, right? Like but that I think that's the danger of whiteness. Whiteness erases like the nuance, right? And so yeah, it could feel boring. I think like I don't know, I'll never be a white guy, so like I'll never like know what it is to check that box and like believe it, right? And like it does this. I've also had to learn to separate white people from whiteness. And I think in my journey of learning how to do this work and doing it well and becoming a scholar of this work, like I think it's real easy to get caught up in these ideas that white people are the devil and white people are, like the worst, right? And there's an and there because that can be true. And like white people also suffer from whiteness. Right. And I like there's a book, like what is it, Dying from Whiteness? Is that what it's called?
Yeah. Oh yeah, you recommended that book to me. I read I picked, yeah.
And so, like we all struggle with that. And to your point, like if you feel bored or you feel like it's boring, it's because some part of your identity has been erased or like destroyed by the blanketing of that.
I just don't want to. I feel like there's a fine line. Like I feel like it's been really important for my identity creation, identity recreation process to unpack like the ways that whiteness hurts me. I also want to always make sure that I don't do that work at the expense of the realization of the privileges that I've unfairly received. That I should never sink into a place of like, look how much whiteness has hurt me, so that I then become blind to the unfair benefits that I've received. Because there's no way that tell me if this statement seems true to you. Like what I've thought is like, there's no way that any amount of like racial trauma that I've received or racial or like mental gymnastics that have twisted my way of thinking or understanding the world. There's no way that that harm could be worse than the harm that I and other people historically and presently like me have inflicted upon those that we white people have othered. I made that a very long statement. There's no way that the harm that I've received could be worse than the harm that's done to people of color. Thinking, processing.
Yeah. I think the numbers are there, right? Like I think like we clearly understand the disparities and we understand the histories and of Black and brown people in this country in this context, right? And so I think, for me, I don't know if it's a question so much of like of that necessarily. It's more this idea that like a lot of people just don't acknowledge that those things actually happened. And so there's something healing in this, like there's something healing when you're acknowledged. Like something heals in you when you're acknowledged, when you're some people call it being seen, right? Like when like your history is not invalidated by like asking further questions or by like, give me the my favorite, like give me the evidence. What do you call that? Like the not the primary evidence, but like they use it in chemistry all the time.
Oh man, I've done chemistry.
It's that like. Anyways, that data, like, give me the
elements.
Not the element. It's right there at the tip of my tongue. I'll come back to it. Like the primary evidence, like this is happening, or like give me the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence that like people are being racist and all these other things, right? Like when you diminish somebody's lived experience, like that's rough. I also think that it's important to acknowledge that white people suffer from whiteness.
Yeah.
Now, I can't tell you like who suffered. Actually, we're not going to get into the conversations about who suffers more from whiteness, and like I see
what you're saying. Yeah.
Like, but
maybe that's a very white. Maybe it's a very white thing for me to do, to try to even put it in terms of measuring one against the other.
Yeah,
but that's just a manifestation of white supremacist thinking.
It could be. I don't know. And I think I think a lot of us, not just white folks, I think we just struggle with like these ideas because they're incredibly complex, right? And this is not a linear issue. This is an incredible, it's systemic, right? And so I remember a good friend of mine, Tomas Alvarez, he was like, Edgar, you're thinking about some of these problems very linearly, and these are systemic issues. And so they require systemic thinking, and they require systems thinking, and they require a very different approach to this work. And so I think it's a good question to have. I really do. Like, I do think it's a quick question to say, like, is my discomfort in this moment greater than or less than somebody else's? Right. I think that's an interesting question to have. And I think for me, more importantly, is like, have you acknowledged the other person's discomfort? Right. And I see this in marriages all the time. I've had two. I'm on my second one. I'm going to be done with my second one. Not in a bad way. Like I'm done at two marriages. I'm done at two marriages. I'm going to stick around if we're going to, this is going to work. And so, I think about like how often I center my feelings and my emotions in conversations. And I'm like, no, but this is what it meant to me. And no, but this is what it meant to me. And like, no, and this is how my feelings are hurt. All meanwhile, like not acknowledging or owning the fact that somebody else's feelings are in the room. Yeah. Right. And I think that that's at the heart of relationship building and these other things that are important. And when we come to this work. And so you're going to be uncomfortable. I can't tell you if your discomfort is more painful or less painful than my discomfort, but I would really appreciate it if you acknowledge my discomfort too.
Yeah.
Right. Is that crazy? I feel like that's still thinking and process, right? I think that that's still something that I need to settle on a little bit more.
Well, I love that you brought in the marriage metaphor, because that's definitely, I think, one of the biggest things that I've learned from my marriage that feels like it's had so much crossover into all my other relationships, and specifically relationships with people of color, has been thinking about not even just personal relationships, but also with uh, just systems and systemic violence. Uh, is that my intent? If I'm relating to my wife and I'm not meaning to hurt her or do something, but it actually does hurt her. That could be something physically, or emotionally, something I say, like if she's hurting, and then I say, well, I didn't mean to, like, it really doesn't matter. Like, if she's in physical pain or emotional pain, it really doesn't matter what I meant. Like, what matters is that the impact was hurtful. I need to attend to her hurting, to her discomfort, uh, and we,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
to add to that, I think that like one of the harder lessons for me in marriage and in these conversations is like, if I hurt somebody intentionally or unintentionally, I also can't determine when the reconciliation happens.
Ooh, that's good.
Right. Like I have to live in the discomfort of, I have to live in the discomfort too. Like, if I know I hurt you, Nathaniel, like if I know I hurt you, like I'm gonna feel uncomfortable about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like whether, I may initially like be defensive about it. I mean, like, I didn't mean to hurt you, but like, maybe you're just thin skinned. Like that's who you are, right? Or I could be like, I don't know, like I feel bad, but I don't know exactly what I did, but like, oh, this is awkward now, and I just really want to apologize, and I want to jump into this, right? The reality, I don't get to tell you when to come to the table to be given an apology and feel better about it, right? Like you have to determine in your time and your like when you're ready to come back, if you're ever going to be ready at all. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's actually the harder things about these conversations is that people want resolution,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like,
Yes.
and the people that want resolution aren't the people that have been hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, how many times I've seen that so many times in workshops and things where it's always the white people who are, that's complex. I just looked at the clock for the first time also, and I realized that
I made it past 8:28. I made it
and
past the 20-minute
I
mark.
said that, yeah, I said that I would keep you past 9, and it's 9:01. We'll wrap up. Yeah, I was just this, I don't know, this could be a can of worms, but I think if there's so many times where I have heard white people in workshops want to jump to actions, which it feels complex. It's, yeah, let's take anti-racist action to disrupt systems. And also I'm very fearful that oftentimes that jumping to action is trying to assuage feelings of guilt or shame, or wanting to jump to that reconciliation so that white people can move past the discomfort quickly, instead of doing the long work of sitting with it and recognizing that it's going to take me for the rest of my life to unravel this.
It's we can talk about Tim Kuhn's like characteristics of white supremacist culture, like things that I just heard you talk about with urgency, the sense of urgency, um, um, the right to comfort, all these other things, right, that like can describe a white supremacist environment or a culture that upholds white supremacist standards. And, I also want to remind people, if they make it this far into this conversation, that thinking is also an action. Right? This work has to be done individually as much as it's collectively. And we have to come to the table and like recognize our own biases, recognize where we're upholding these standards, recognize where we're potentially harming people, coming to terms with that for ourselves, and figuring out how to do better, like incrementally, right? Like I don't like that's the other thing. Like again, we lean into perfection. Like I didn't do this the right way, so therefore I'm not going to do it. Or I can't do this the right way, so I'm not going to even attempt to it, right? Like this idea of perfectionism in these spaces. And so I offer to folks like thinking about how you're showing up in these environments and thinking about whether you've harmed people or not along the way. Like that's also the work, right? That's something that one can do without having permission from anybody else to do. That ultimately, I think, improves the environments that people are in.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. Is there anything else that you would want to say to close, or anything more about? We started off talking very, very, very briefly about Latinx Ed Collaborative. Anything else you'd want to say in general or about Latinx Ed Collaborative before we sign off?
You know what? I'd like to, since I have an opportunity here, I'd like to clarify one thing. I recently read somewhere that like I in my organization, like we were cultural Marxist. And I just want to clarify that I have no idea what that means. And that, you know, I also want to clarify that like I don't think it's radical for us to like want more Latino teachers. Like it doesn't feel radical to me because like only 1% of educators in Kansas City are Latino, which means only 260 teachers compared to 51,000 students. And so for me, like asking for one more Latino teacher in every school building doesn't seem like a radical ask or request. But I've seen some of the comments. I don't read the comments, but when I do, like I try to learn. So I just want to clarify that, like, I don't know what that means. And so if anybody's willing to teach me about what cultural Marxism is, so I can either say that I am or not, like that would be incredibly helpful.
Wow. So wait, that was levied as an insult?
I think I don't know. Like, you
I'm
know,
a I'm a big fan of Marx. Like there are many, many things about Marxist ideas that I'm a big fan of. And I think that are, and it's not even, well, anyway, many of the ideas, it's not even a matter of being a fan. They're just useful ideas to understanding or thinking about culture. Oh man,
but here's
we'll
the
throw
thing.
around terms.
I'm not gonna, you know what? I've never read Marx. I never read Nietzsche. Is that right? Friedrich Nietzsche. Like I've never read these people. And so I just want to learn. Like, so if somebody can explain that to me, because you know, somebody may come on this podcast and comment on it and call me a cultural Marxist for asking that, you know, we have more Latino teachers. So I just want to know. I want to know what that means. And should I read Marx? I don't know. I didn't really do well with economics back in the day. I just want more Latinos in education. I think that that's a healthy thing.
Yeah. I just think that like it makes me think, well, we should close. I had so the high school I went to, a third of my high school were Latino students. And I can't, like, I can think of one Latino educator in that school. Like that stinks. Like that.
Yeah,
Why not
and
more?
I got to remind people that like I was taught by white teachers. You know, I don't have any issues against white folks and like white teachers in general. Like, I just know that it's important that like, you know, some of my more social emotional needs weren't met.
Mm.
I remember being in Spokane and like being terrified to speak Spanish because I thought somebody was gonna hurt me or my family. Like I literally like was in fear of that.
Mm.
And so I can only imagine like what having somebody that looked like me or spoke Spanish or like was part of the culture would have. I could have gone to them and maybe asked them a question and be like, hey, I don't feel safe here. How would you recommend that I like navigate this? Clearly like in 11-year-old ways, because that's not an 11-year-old question. Like I don't feel safe here and I want to know more. Maybe it is an 11-year-old question. I don't know. Not for me. And so that's what I want. I want students to see themselves, because those are conversations that, I mean, otherwise never happen. If our folks aren't in the room.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
it's not Marxism as much as it is like caring for humanity and the humanity of our students.
Big thanks to Edgar Palacios for coming on the show with such wholeness and for sharing his story so openly. You can learn more about Latinx Education Collaborative at latinxedco.org. Again, that's latinxedco.org. Thank you for listening to Wide Ruled. Wide Ruled was first produced as a part of Brain Root Light and Sound. And also thanks to Dominique Fields for the theme music. Cheers.